A very pleasant good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Welcome to the Chronicles, and this is Rita Gadi. Today we go solo because the title of our program, as you will read later, is To Look Back, Move On. So what are we looking back? The world in which we live in actually does not yield to anything that is quite comfortable at this stage. I am referring not only to the geopolitical scenario all over the world, because now we have all kinds of problems that are occurring in Europe, in Africa, in Asia, and all of this. And also now you have a new president in the United States of America, and that's a saying that whatever happens in America affects the whole world. As a matter of fact, they say something like, if America sneezes, the whole world catches a cold. So be that as it may, it still is considered to be one of the most powerful countries in the world, and we have seen how it has stretched its power, its might, its influence in practically all countries, all regions, all continents. Be that as it may, with the new president now, President Donald Trump, we are also trying to look at how our relationship with America would continue in such a manner as we have always been told that it is ironclad, whatever that means, na parang napakahigpit ng hawak nila at ang ating pagkasasama sa Amerika. Ngunit, as I've said, I will try to go back in time because there are certain periods in our political history which is worth going back to, so that we can look at the pattern of how our government has operated, how our leaders have also managed the situation of the progress of the world and also of our country, and what has happened since the time that we've had changes, major changes in several episodes of our political history. Since the only president that I could perhaps talk about with, not with authority, but a presidential period where I have had an exposure that was both personal, political, and also in a manner that we can discuss many things that happened then, which could be what I am referring to as looking back. Because that particular period of Ferdinand Edralin Marcos is 20 years. If we count also the additional several months afterward, then it could be something like 21 years. But just to say, just to be more specific about it, it's been 2 decades. Now we look into this, we look back so that we can determine how our government was operating in a manner that was already part of the American influence even prior to that. But then we could see there that there were many episodes that happened where the influence or the partnership or whatever else you call it, the relationship we had with the United States were either in the brink of being ended or that it would be continued. But whatever it is, that is where I'd like to look back to. Because after Ferdinand Edralin Marcos, many years after that, from 1986 to this president, and that is the junior of Ferdinand Edralin Marcos, we have his junior, Ferdinand Romualdez Marcos Jr. This is not by way of comparing, but this is by way of looking at the stage we're at and how we can move on in the manner by which his father, since 1966 to 1986, was able to handle the influence or the workings of the United States of America. So 1965, that was when President Marcos ran for the presidency. But prior to that, he was already in politics. After the Second World War and after his practice of law, after his being quite prominent already as a lawyer, he decided to enter politics. And the first field that he entered into was in Congress. And then after Congress, the Senate, which he stayed in for only about 2 years because he was already aiming for the office of the presidency. What am I trying to say here? Well, early on, when he entered politics, he already had in mind his ideal as far as service to the country is concerned. It is not just to end in Congress for all the terms that is allowed by law, or is it going to end when he becomes senator? But he would want to pursue this until he becomes the head of government, the head of state, as president. So you could see that he designed his political career and all his actions towards that end. So what am I trying to say here? How many of our politicians at the early stage of their political life already aimed for the highest office? Or are they aiming only for what is present right now for the House of Representatives or the Senate, or for mayorship or governorship as executives? But how many actually already had in mind, as soon as they entered politics, the office of the president is the target? I am saying this because that is where you could see how intent and how the ideal and how the vision of Ferdinand Edralin Marcos was, insofar as not just public service, but insofar as leading the country the way he would have wanted to. As a matter of fact, his battle cry at the time was, and it was repeated when he ran for several re-elections for the office of the president, was, "This nation can be great again." It sounds like Trump. It sounds like Trump borrowed it from him or whatever it is. But Marcos was way ahead as far as that cry is concerned. So in 1966, he already said that. He aimed to make the office of the nation great again. When we had the chance to interview him when he was re-elected 1969, and the same cry was the same statement was what he made: "This nation will be great again." I asked him, when were we great? Because he said again. So this is where he gave the whole history of how it was when we were still divided into tribes and datoship and sultanates, and you had the rajas and all of this heads, and we were very feudalistic. But even in these little kingdoms, as we would call it, like for instance, Manila was one of the central kingdoms, and there you had Raja Sulaiman, who was the head, and that was supposed to be one of the biggest also as far as the datoship was concerned. And so he was saying that the Rajas were already wearing gold. They had trinkets, they had bracelets, they had necklaces made of gold, their scarves and their whatever little clothing they had, because they were really bare, they already wore silk. So even at the time, we already had the fineries or the luxurious elements that actually was used by the leaders. But that was not what made it great. But what made the Philippines great at the time were these little tribes where you had the different villages thriving and being successful and were already engaged in trade, not only among each other, but also with foreign countries. For instance, like in India, we already had not trade relations, but we already had barter, whatever else you would call it. We had economic activities. And then, of course, China, with the coming in of several of the sampans, as you call it, the little boats that were coming in. And then the biggest of them all, as far as trade and economy is concerned, was there in Sulu, where you had the Sultanate of Sulu, having this strong economic and trade relations with China, to the consequence that when the Sultan of Sulu died, the sultanate, the kingdom in China decided that he should be buried there, and all his relatives would be given Chinese family names and would be considered as Chinese citizenship. That was how close the relationship was. And to this day, those of you who would like to visit China, for instance, then you could go to that place in Diju where you have the burial ground of the Sultan and some of his relatives and heirs, or the progeny that the Sultan had living as regular Chinese people in China. What I'm trying to say is that that was how the idea or the ideal that the senior Marcos had, to be able to make this country great again. And so it was that shortly after his presidency, I think it was only just a couple of months, he was invited already for a state visit to the United States of America. At the time, we had the Vietnam War, which was raging. This was the communists trying to take over the whole of Vietnam to convert it to make it a communist country, and that was where America came in, and that was where practically you had that long war of the Vietnam and America war. And that was when America needed all the allies it could have to be able to be with them as far as fighting the communists in Vietnam. And at the time, President Marcos Sr. was the shining example of a democratic country here in Asia, in the Southeast Asian region. And so he was invited. I've already talked about this some time back, that he was given prominence by the American media as being the most decorated war veteran, and also that he topped the bar, and that he was the leading democratic statesman and president of a country that is an ally of the United States of America. So he was the cover of all their big magazines and of their newspapers. And Mrs. Marcos, Imelda Romualdez Marcos, was considered to be also one of the most beautiful women of the world, etc. So all of this flattering propaganda actually prior to the visit of President Marcos' state visit to America, that was all to entice him to be able to announce then, as he addresses the U.S. Joint Congress, that the Philippines will be joining their ally, their friend, the former colony, the United States of America, in the Vietnam War. But that was not what Marcos did. So you can imagine how frustrated America was. What did Marcos do? So instead of talking about the Vietnam War, when he addressed the joint session of Congress, House of Representatives and their Senate, plus all the other military officials and their courts, the entire government, as a matter of fact, listening to him, he said, well, America should not forget. And what was that? Well, that was because he was aiming at the promise of America, not just a promise, but because our soldiers fought with the United States Armed Forces here in the Far East, what you call the USAFE, United States of America Forces in the Far East, our soldiers were part of that military that fought the Japanese here in the Philippines. So because of that, we were entitled to the veterans' pay, the pension, and of course, other benefits that were given to the veterans. But that was not given. So you can imagine from when the war ended, when was this? 1944. We were liberated at the time. The war ended also here and in Europe. So from 1944 to 1966, when President Marcos assumed the presidency, ilang years yun, hindi pa nabayaran yung mga veterans' pay para sa mga sundalong Pilipino. So when he addressed the joint Congress, the joint House of Representatives in America, he did not speak about joining America in the Vietnam War. What he spoke about was that America should not forget, and he was quite articulate and eloquent about this, even poetic, because he was describing how the blood of the American soldier and the blood of the Filipino soldier mingled in the fields in defense of the country against the Japanese. So there you have it. And of course, America was quite, taken aback with that, because they were expecting that President Marcos would announce that the Philippines would be joining their ally, but he did not. 10 days after his state visit, President Lyndon Johnson came over and called for a summit of the 5 member countries of the CETO. That was the Southeast Asian Trade Organization, ASEAN. That's the mother of the ASEAN that we have today. So he called for a summit, not just of the 5 member countries of the CETO, but also including New Zealand, Australia, you know, and even several other countries, so that the summit here would again try to force our President Marcos, to announce that, okay, sige, we will join na in the Vietnam War, but still that did not happen. So twice their attempt to have us join the Vietnam War was frustrated. I'm trying to figure this with as history that is looking back. That is how the American influence would have happened at that time, and would have be part of what is happening as far as the relationship is concerned. That was 1966. And the Vietnam War still continued until several years, when the Americans had to retreat from Vietnam. So yun ang malungkot. But what we did was, we opened our shores for the Vietnamese refugees. And as a matter of fact, we still have that Vietnam village in several of our provinces in the mid-Philippines, which even won a United Nations award for the kind of work that was undertaken for the refugees coming from Vietnam. So many things happened during those first years of Ferdinand Marcos Sr., until sometime there was now the communist insurgency that was getting stronger, and there was the need for the declaration of martial law because of several episodes that was threatening the central government. One of them, of course, is the rising number and ammunitions and violence that was being inflicted by the New People's Army, the communist insurgency. And then the other was because of what's happening in Mindanao, when you had these rebel forces wanting to secede the island of Mindanao, Sulu, and Palawan away from the Republic. And then, of course, you had the rise of criminality in Metro Manila and in the villages adjacent, together with some other cities that were also had high criminality. So because of these events and because of those threats to the central government, Marcos had to declare martial law, which is a constitutional and a legal provision. So because of martial law, we had several other events that happened at the time. And you must remember that America not only approved of this, because there was this consultation with President Marcos and President Nixon at the time, where we had that, the story that martial law is not in the American Constitution when martial law was declared there. And that was what President Nixon said. If they did not declare martial law during that Civil War, then there would not be a United States of America, because the buck stops there in the office of the president, and you have to consolidate and unite the country. So that was one of the reasons why it was important to strengthen the central government, and that was why martial law, as I've said, had the tacit approval also of the United States of America. Be that as it may, many things occurred and happened during that period. So again, here is where I can say that relationship between the United States of America and the Philippines was actually on a tightrope in many instances. For instance, during the period of martial law in 1974, President Marcos decided to open diplomatic relations with the Union of Soviet Socialist Republic, USSR, as we call it then. That was a communist country and an enemy of the United States of America. Communism and democracy divided the world, in such a way that we had all of this, espionage going on between elements of the bureaucracy of Russia, of the USSR and America, and all of these James Bond films, if you're familiar with them, actually pictured how it was. that was what they called the Cold War. We were not in open confrontation with Russia or America with Russia, but there was this Cold War, so that countries which are considered to be communists are enemies. So we opened diplomatic relations with the enemy of the United States, which was the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, which is now called the Russian Federation. Again, within the year, we also opened diplomatic relations with the People's Republic of China. Can you imagine that? Another communist country, not yet as strong as it is today, but already you had the end game of the Cultural Revolution. Mao Zedong has already retired. You have Chou En-lai, you have Deng Xiaoping, and I'm sorry, you had Chou En-lai and Deng Xiaoping. I'm sorry, Deng Xiaoping already in power, and there you had the continuation of the Cultural Revolution, where you had the Red Guards actually doing many of the disciplining of the peasants and the work that was needed in order to feed the many millions of Chinese, and also to begin their factories and their industry, etc. So you can imagine how during that period of martial law, you had two important foreign relations which President Marcos undertook against the United States of America's enemies. So we befriended Russia and we befriended China. As a matter of fact, the first opening of visits was undertaken by Madame Imelda Romualdez Marcos together with our junior president. So that was where he also met Chairman Mao Zedong and had also a meeting with Chou En-lai and Deng Xiaoping. So what I'm trying to trace here is looking back how we behaved at that time against the interests and and of course of the United States of America by befriending and opening and establishing, as a matter of fact, embassies in America's enemies. So, did America cut relationship with us? No. Why? Because the American bases are still here. They could not afford to, to antagonize Philippine government because of what it has done, what President Edralin Marcos has done. Instead, it just kept quiet with that. In fact, it was President Nixon who was congratulated even with a personal letter from Chou En-lai, which Mrs. Marcos brought, because when President Nixon stepped down from the presidency, that was one of the letters that she brought to him already, with the acknowledgement of China, because it was President Nixon who really said that we should befriend China at that stage anyway. But also during that period of martial law, that's about 11 years from from the declaration until it was lifted, 1981. We had the organization of the NEDA, the National Economic Development Authority, which was the mother of all the economic programs and policies that President Marcos intended for the country. So you can imagine how every province is already demographically, politically, and agriculturally positioned in such a way that we could have progress and economic development by having all of them concentrated on what is the main program that President Marcos Edralin had. But other than that, other than the creation of the NEDA, it was also the establishment of the new society where discipline was priority. So, as they say, it was so important that you cross the pedestrian lane or you get caught, you get not just a fine, but you get lectured. Many other little ordinances and laws you had to follow, or else you will suffer the consequences. So discipline was a priority, which is very important for a country that is developing. That was the part of the new society. Other than that, many things were also ongoing. That was the time when we had the establishment of many of our institutions, like the tertiary hospitals, the heart center, the kidney center, the lung center, etc. That was when we had the massive infrastructure from north to south, the bridges, the airports, and all of this, all of the other means of communication that had to be constructed. And then we had the first LRT here in Asia, in the ASEAN region, rather. That was one of those that Mrs. Marcos was able to obtain from the Belgian government, the first LRT. So that was all part of the NEDA planning, how the traffic and the transportation could be eased insofar as the metropolis is concerned. That was also the establishment of the Metropolitan Development Authority, which included at the time 13 towns and 4 cities, which is now practically all of that 14 cities, now known as the Metro Manila Development Authority, which was then the Metro Manila Commission, which was also headed by Mrs. Marcos. That was during that time. So you can imagine how important that period of martial law was. But the most important, because here I am referring to our relationship with the United States of America, it was at that time when President Marcos declared that the military defense treaty between the United States of America and the Philippines should be further reviewed, and that certain changes will have to be undertaken because times are a-changing. The geopolitical scenario is now a different historical period altogether. So, what did Marcos do at the time? What did he do at the time? Well, the military bases had some kind of a timeline, although it was not written in black and white, but a timeline of 99 years. Marcos reduced this to 25 years with the review of every 5 years, so as to give an opportunity for whoever will become president after every 4 years could be able to do something as far as checking on the military defense treaty again. So from 99 to 25 to 5. As a matter of fact, it would have ended, I mean, this 95, 25, 99, 25, and 5 years would have ended way beyond his term. But since there was going to be a snap elections, which I will get into, would have ended in 1992. And that was during the time already of Mrs. Aquino. And then you have the senators, led by Senator Salonga, claiming that they were the ones who put an end to the bases. No, it was the fact that it was Marcos who actually programmed it already from 99 to 25 to 5, plus the reduction of the hectarage occupied by the bases. So it's no longer just so many 100,000 hectares. Now it's been reduced to just several 10,000 or so. And then you had the declaration also of the president that he does not wish that it will just be military aid that will be given by the United States. It would be something like, or something that is dependent on Congress to approve as far as the granting of military assistance to the Philippines is concerned. Marcos said, no, you pay rent for the occupation that you have on Subic, the naval base, and on Clark, the Air Force Base. So medyo masakit yon ang pagkasabi niya. Hindi lang basta kayo magbibigay ng aid at ng military assistance, at yon depende pa kung i-aprobahan ng Congress, at depende rin kung magkano ang ibibigay. Ay hindi na pwede yon. Sapagkat andyan kayo, you're occupying Philippine territory, the naval base in Subic, and you're also occupying Philippine territory, which is the Clark Air Force Base. You pay rent for the number of hectares that you are occupying. So because of that occupation nga, yun na nga, medyo, I'm just trying to emphasize the kind of relationship that President Ferdinand Edralin Marcos had at the time, and this was during martial law, with the United States of America. And speaking of the length of time, etc., and the hectarage and so forth, at lahat ng yan na sinasabi nga because it's Philippine territory, magbayad kayo ng renta, Marcos also ordered that it will be a Philippine commander that will be in charge of the bases, together with his counterpart, whoever is the the American official there in charge of that, pero hindi lang Amerikano, Pilipino ang mamumuno doon sa bases. And it is the Philippine flag alone that will fly over these bases in Subic and in Clark. So this is the kind of relationship we had, which was quite critical at the time. Kasi nga, imagine reducing the number of years that the Americans can stay. Kaya nangyari nga noong 1992, wala silang magawa kasi yun na ang ginawa ni Marcos na 25, 5, and 5, 99 to 25 and 5 na ang katapusan ay yung sa 1992. Although it was already the time of Mrs. Aquino, still, it was Marcos who actually programmed that timeline. Other than that, we also had the termination of what is known as the Laurel-Langley Treaty or the parity rights. Ano yung parity rights na yan? Because we were a colony of America for 45 years, even after the war in 1944, patuloy pa rin yung equal rights ng Amerikano dito sa Pilipinas. Kaya nga parity rights. Pareho ang kanilang rights dito. They could enter into business, they could own corporations, they could enter into all kinds of activities, they could own properties the way Filipinos do. Parity rights nga. That was as a consequence of their colonizing us for 45 years, and then after the war, 1944, until 1974. So hanggang 1974, yung parity rights na yan. That was no longer extended by President Ferdinand Edralin Marcos. 1974, tapos na. Ended na yung parity rights. So that was when you had the, ang tawag nito, you had the Americans rushing to to sell their properties, to get rid of their investments, etc. and all, kasi hindi na sila pwede. Under our Constitution, the 1970 Constitution, nakalagay doon na pagka foreigner ka, 60-40 lang ang pwede mo sa business and you cannot own real estate. So, 60-40, 40% ang hawak mo, 60 ang Filipino. Ganun lang ang best business na pwede mong pasukan. And you cannot own property. So, yun ang isa pa rin na nangyari because of the termination of the parity rights. So that also occurred during that time, that period, not because of martial law, but as I said, during that period. So also during that period, as I've said, we had the establishment of many institutions that are now still serving us. I mentioned the tertiary hospitals. I mentioned the infrastructure of the highways from north to south, the ports, airports, and ports. As a matter of fact, Cebu, for instance, the connection of the islands, Cebu and Mactan, plus the airport, and of course, rural electrification. Remember that prior to the parity rights, hawak lahat ng Amerikano yan. Meralco, hawak nila yan. Electric company, telephone company, gas company, water, lahat. Kanila lahat yan, hawak nila. When they but they had to let go of that, sino ang bumili niyan? Well, you could see in history how all of this were purchased by several corporations, Filipino corporations, na pinahawak din ni Marcos sa mga Pilipino. So you had, for instance, Meralco, Pilipino na yan. Then you had a water system, Pilipino na yan. But all of this, government ang namamahala. Binili na sa Amerikano. Pero public service yung mga yan, kaya Philippine government na ang namamahala. Ang malungkot na nangyari dito, nung dumating yung ibang administration, gumawa ng batas na yung mga public service na yan ay ibinigay naman sa mga oligarchs. So yun ang malungkot. Anyway, I'm trying to trace now again the parallelisms that we have as far as what was happening, not parallelisms, but the parallel movements that were occurring between the United States of America and the Philippines during that period. Now, when 1986 came, Well, prior to that, nagkaroon pa rin tayo ng massive agricultural production, rice especially. Kasi nagtayo si President Marcos ng International Rice Research Institute kung saan pag-aralan paano ba tayo makakaani ng ganito kadami, anong kailangan fertilizer, insecticides, etc. So, ginamit lahat yan hanggang sa lumaki at lumaganap yung ating rice production to the effect that we were now exporting rice even. Can you imagine what a beautiful season it must have been? So yun yung period na yan, na kahit na nagkaroon ng konting samaan ng loob, kung masasabi natin ganon, sapagkat maraming ginawa si President Edralin na hindi sang-ayon sa kagustuhan ng Amerika, ay nagkaroon din tayo ng ating sariling sikap ng production. That's why you were able to export rice at that time. So that was also the establishment ng Kadiwa. Iisa lang yan dati eh. Yang Kadiwa na yan is a storage, cold storage and with different kinds of facilities para lahat ng inaani sa bukid doon ibabagsak para ito ay di-distribute. Wala nang middleman. Kaya mas mura ang bilihin, sinasabi nga na yung kadiwa na yan ay diretso na magmula sa bukid doon sa mga mamimili. Now, President Junior is trying to replicate this by setting up also that kind of an arrangement. Hindi na kasing laki ng original kadiwa, pero ito, he has organized and established and will continue to establish several of these Kadiwa stores all over the country, which is the idea that was born during that time of his father, when martial law was declared, that wala nang middleman, na wala nang mga ibang tao pa na makikialam sa presyo ng bilihin, diretso na kaagad yan doon sa mga mamibili, sa mga commercial, sa mga taong mamimili. Tayo yon, the common tao. Several other things were also taken up during the time, but then we are now approaching 1986. So anong nangyari? At bakit parang bigla ba na kinailangan ng Amerika tanggalin si President Edralin Marcos? Well, prior to that, 1981 or so, may nangyari na patay si Ninoy Aquino sa tarmac. Hanggang sa kasalukuyan, sabi nga, ang pumatay dyan na isang hired killer na komunista or whatever. Pero yung timing ay dumating sa punto na kinakailangan ng Amerika na may gagawin para magising ang tao at magalit kay Marcos. Kaya nakita ninyo sa simula, yun ang kanilang ginawang dahilan na kasi napatay si Ninoy Aquino sa tarmac. Pumasok na ngayon ang mga finance institutions ng IMF at saka World Bank. 1981, naghigpit sila ng credit. Imagine, 486 banks of the IMF and the World Bank hinigpitan ng credit sa Pilipinas. Talagang papahirapan nila si Marcos para lumuhod kung ano man ang kailangan na luluhudan. Pero hindi yan ginawa ni President Marcos because noon gusto na lang pumasok na tayo dito sa WTO, World Trade Organization, para sila na rin na magdidikta kung ano ang mga tariff na kanilang ibibigay o ipapatong, sapagkat alam naman natin yan, basta finance minister natin o finance secretary, mga lahat na yan, Amerikano ang nagsasabi kung sino ang gusto nila. So whatever reason there is behind that, yun na ang nangyari over the past other presidents and even after 1986, if you will observe it quite closely. But nonetheless, yun ang nangyari nung si Ninoy Aquino ay napatay doon sa tarmac. Naghigpit para ma-agitate ang tao na kasalanan ni Marcos, ayan na nangyari at ngayon naghihirap kayo sapagkat hinigpitan ang credit. But again, this is a personal knowledge that I was able to obtain nung nagkaroon ng trial sa New York at nag-testify doon ang former central bank governor, si Jaime Laya. At doon, tinanong siya, o anong nangyari noong 1981 na naghigpit ang IMF at World Bank? Bumagsak ba kayo sa Pilipinas? Ano bang ginawa ni Marcos? So it was Laya who testified that he told the president that we have problems now. And that this is what the IMF and the World Bank has done. And so Laya was cross-examined. So what did Marcos do? And Mr. Laya said this in court, and it's in court records to po, pwede niyong basahin. President Marcos called up several banks in Switzerland. That was baka hindi eksakto yon ang pag-quote ko, pero sinabi niya yon, and that is court records. You can read that in court. I have the records of the court too, if you want to look at them. Pero sa New York, andyan yan, mababasa nyo. So he said, President Marcos called several banks in Switzerland. Do you know who these banks? Do you know what banks? Do you know who? Sabi niya, no, I don't. Kung sino ang kinausap niya. Do you know the banks? Yes, sinabi niya. Swiss Bank Corporation, Credit Suisse. Meron pa siyang 3 bangko yon na sinabi niya. And then what happened? Tinanong siya sa cross-examination. And then money came in. Dollars came in. I think something like, I may not have the exact amount, but something like $700 million came in. At alam niya yan sapagkat siya yung andon sa central bank. Alam niya yung mga pumapasok na pera. And then, again, as I've said, you have the records there. Exactly how much came in. So money came in, na-save yung ating ekonomiya at the time in 1981 nung naghigpit ang World Bank at IMF para nga mahirapan si Marcos. Bakit nila gusto naman pahirapan si Marcos? Kasi gusto silang alisin. Bakit nila gusto alisin? Because at about the same time, not about the same time, just a couple of days apart from each other, nung napatay si Ninoy sa tarmac, inoperahan si Marcos ng kidney transplant. At ang balita ay, yung unang transplant ay ni-reject ng kanyang katawan. Hindi mo naman kaagad mapapalitan yan. You have to wait for at least several months. Ang kwento, I do not have documentary confirmation in this, but I was able to talk to some of his doctors. Nagkaroon ng second operation noong November. But between August 21, kung saan yung araw na napatay si Ninoy Aquino, I think it was August 27 or thereabouts, nung nagkaroon ng surgery si President Marcos. In fact, kung matatandaan ninyo, nung siya ay humarap doon sa camera nung pagkamatay ni Ninoy at sinabi nga niya na kagagawan ito ng mga komunista, hindi siguro niya nahalata na napakalayo nung camera sa kanya sapagkat at the time he was recuperating from a major surgery which was a kidney transplant. At alam ito ng mga well, anyway, alam ng mga doktor, alam ng mga malapit sa kanya. And then of course, that is already now public knowledge. Although, as I've said, I do not have documentary evidence on this. Anyway, so yun ang nangyari sa panahon na yun. Sapagkat kung sakaling merong mangyari at hindi, at pumanaw si President Marcos nung panahon na yun, na nire-reject yung kung ano man yung kidney na nilagay sa kanya, na nag-transplant sa kanya, ang kasing nakasulat na dokumento na ang alam ng Amerikano ay yung handwritten din ni President Marcos, na ang mamumuno kung sakaling mamatay siya ay si Imelda Marcos kasama ng parang Council of Advisor or Council of Elders or ano, na kasama ang militar at kasama ang private individuals. Sila ang parang council na magte-take over muna kung sakaling pumanaw si President Marcos At pagkatapos, maybe in a year or so, sila na rin ang tatawag ng national elections for the presidency. Yun ang kinakatakot ng Amerika. Takot sila kung si Mrs. Marcos ang mamumuno. Bakit natakot sila? Bakit sila natatakot? Well, I have been honored to have covered several of Mrs. Marcos' diplomatic missions. Nasabi ko nga yung pagbukas natin ng diplomatic relations sa Russia, sa China, siya ang nanguna bago naging official. Ang laki ng kanyang reception. May retrato pa nga, kung matatandaan ninyo. Hinalikan pa ni Mao Zedong yung kamay ni Imelda. So, all of this actually could indicate na magaling si Mrs. Marcos when it comes to diplomatic relations with big powers. Can you imagine? And other than that, with an enemy of people in Mindanao, si Muammar Gaddafi, na at that time nagsusuporta ng logistics at ng armas doon sa mga rebeldeng gusto magsisid. Pinuntahan niya yon. And, you know, as I've said, I have personal knowledge of the visit of Mrs. Marcos there and her conversations with Colonel Gaddafi. And what resulted? Wow, one of the best documents ever for Mindanao, the Tripoli Agreement. An autonomous region of 9 and 12, and the 5 cities within regions 9 and 12. The establishment of a regional assembly, may parliament na. The establishment of a regional council na parang executive department na. It was Simeon Dato Manong, in fact, who became the chairman of that regional council. And then you had Abulkair Alonto there as the speaker of the parliament. So dalawang region yan, 10 probinsyang nagsama. You did not segregate just the Muslim, predominantly Muslim communities. No, you banded together all of them in these 2 regions for an autonomy that would be able to function on its own without having to clear major items, major policies with the central government. Ay hindi lang pwede yung hindi sila pwede magtayo ng sanilang military component. Hindi sila pwedeng mag-imprenta ng money. Hindi sila pwedeng pumasok ng foreign affairs. Yun lang ang mga nasa central government. And I don't know what others, of course, printing of money, etc. Pero lahat ng bagay ng isang executive department, ang isang head ng department na yan, meron silang kapangyarihan. Sa legislative, meron silang parliament din. Nagagawa sila ng sarili ng batas na makakabuti doon sa sinasabi ko ng regions 9 and 12, 10 provinces and 5 cities therein. Yan nagawa lahat nung panahon na yon na si Mrs. Marcos ang nagsimula na nakipag-usap doon sa mga taong sila ang makakatulong na mabigyan ng kapayapaan, peace, in fact, for Mindanao at the time. So from 1976, yung Tripoli Agreement na yan, hanggang 1986, imagine, there was peace in Mindanao because of the Tripoli Agreement. Kaya sabi ko, napakagandang dokumento na yan at napakalungkot na hindi yan ang ginamit na basihan para dito sa BARM. Itong BARM, pinili lang yung mga probinsya, mga bayan kung saan predominantly Muslim. Bakit? Tapos, dun sa dulo, Sulu, Basilan, and Tawi-Tawi lang. Oh my goodness. Tapos kumuha pa kayo ng ibang barangay dun sa amin sa North Cotabato. Hiwa-hiwalay, they're not even together. And then you only considered an autonomy for the Muslim provinces or towns or cities. My goodness, sayang. You see? And Junior Marcos has also been part of the BARM when it was being discussed in the Senate. Kaya sabi ko sana binalikan. Look back at the Tripoli Agreement and take into consideration what was there as part of the union of 2 regions and of course the larger autonomous region for Mindanao. Anyway, so kaya nga sabi ko, look back move on. Pero medyo mahirap nang balikan yon sapagkat ngayon meron na tayong BARM. But what I'm trying to say is, it was during that time. But remember, prior to that, the CIA, or the Invisible Government Report, was not just the secession of Mindanao. No, it was Minsupala. Mindanao, Sulu, and Palawan kasama. And President Adeline Marcos knew of this. Kaya ang Palawan, when he was designing the regions of the country, yan, NEDA din yan, ang Palawan, sinama niya sa Region 4, dito sa Metro Manila, kaya Region 4A, para hindi masama yan doon sa gusto ng CIA na Mindanao, Sulu, ang Palawan, lahat yan gagawing South Mindanao. You know, the Americans have this strange reputation of balkanizing the world, North and South Vietnam, North and South Korea, East and West Berlin, East and West Timor, lahat yan. Nakita nyo, hanggang sa kasalukuyan, yung North and South Sudan, ganyan pa rin sila naghahati para mas, I don't know, divide and rule, if you would call it, but that's the way they go. They've had that. They have this notoriety of divide, and that would have happened if President Adeline Marcos did not come in to stop it from happening, that Mindanao, Sulu, and Palawan will be part of Southern Philippines. Oh my goodness, mahahati pa tayo. Anyway, so all of this was happening during that time, and I told you na bakit nagbadali na alisin siya. Well, because they were worried about his health, baka mamatay ka agad at si Imelda magte-take over. And then, of course, they were also worried kasi 1986 na yan. 87, 88, 89, 90, 91, 92, 93, 92. 7 years na lang, expired na yung military defense treaty na yan, yung bases na yan. Kaya kailangan makapaglagay sila ng tao na poproteksyonan yung bases na yan. So maraming dahilan, but that was one of them. So what did they do? Other than the fact that they were worried about the bases, they had to dramatize something against Marcos. Kaya pinasok nila yung cronyism daw, yung mga kaibigan niya na nag-handle nito mga public services na mga corporations na yan, mga crony daw yan. They're not cronies, they're nominees. Na sila nag-handle ng, pero public service. They do not own it. It's public service. Anyway, so they try to dramatize that to the extent that si Solarts, Congressman Stephen Solarts, spoke in Congress, US Congress, saying that si Marcos kailangan daw imbestigahan na yung US aid at yung military assistance, baka daw meron din mga ninakaw si Marcos doon. He made that speech in the US Congress. That is to attack and to give reason and justification kung bakit siya kailangan tanggalin. Can you imagine that? So ano nangyari? The General Accounting Office of the United States of America investigated the accusation of Stephen Solarts and came out with the declaration that not a single cent at all was taken from military aid or military assistance by the government of President Ferdinand Adeline Marcos. That's a GAA report. We have a copy of that. Did they make this public? No. Lumabas yan May na, 1986. Si Marcos nasa Hawaii na. So can you imagine? Ngayon, kailangan asikasuhin ngayon nila na ipagpatuloy na yung kanilang accusation kay Marcos na nagnakaw. Kaya nila kinasuhan ang mga Marcoses ng RICO. Racketeering, Influence, and Corrupt Organization Act. Napahiya na sila na tinanggal si Marcos, na sabi nila corrupt pero wala silang preba. So they did it in New York. We happened to be there. It was Imelda na lang ang tumatayo for the Marcos family sapagkat namatay na ang Presidente Marcos 1989. So yung trial sa New York, 1990, 3 months na trial, 95 witnesses, 350,000 documents, ni isang dokumento, ni isang witness walang nakapagsabi na may ninakaw sa taong bayan. None. Wala. Kaya unanimous decision ng jury not guilty. So can you imagine all of this fuss now, people talking, nagnakaw, nagnakaw, nagnakaw. Yun na, the mightiest sword of justice is the United States of America. Together with the assistance of the PCGG, together with the assistance of the Swiss government, lahat ng dokumento sa Switzerland, lahat ng dokumento na nakuha nila sa Malacanang, lahat ng dokumento na kinuha sa mga bangko, lahat ng dokumento na bit-bit ng mga marko sa Hawaii, kinonfiscate nila. All of that, altogether, 350,000 pages of documents. And they got 95 witnesses, bank tellers, bank cashiers, bank managers, even officials of the Swiss government. Lahat yan. Andun sa court sa New York. Again, not one document, not one witnesses was able to say that there was money taken from the Philippine government. Kaya not guilty. Okay, what am I trying to do now? I am trying to show how America works behind the scenes or in front of the scenes, however else you call it. It is like a tableau. Kung meron silang gustong tanggalin na tao, pinapasama nila. The way they did it with Gaddafi, the worst person in the world, the most evil. And yet he had free education, free hospitalization, free practically, lahat na. Libre. Ang laki ng kinikita nila eh. Only 2 million population, but look at what they were earning. Plus, may percentage din yung mga tao for whatever earnings they get from oil. Meron din share, lahat ng tao doon. Is that a bad leader? They had agricultural productivity. He desalinated water from the Mediterranean. Makita mo sana yung kanyang La Revolution Verte, the green revolution of Gaddafi. They were producing their vegetables, their rice, everything, their fruits, because of desalination na ginawa nila. Anyway, so what I'm trying to say is they demonize first the leader that they would want to remove. The same thing happened in so many other instances. In Iraq, for instance, yun din ang Iran, yun din ang ginawa nila sa Iran nung tinanggal na. Ganon din ang ginawa nila sa Iraq when they wanted to remove Saddam Hussein. Weapons of mass destruction. You imagine how it was. You have General Powell there in the United Nations in tears, screaming out that there are weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. Pero walang nakita. Tatlong United Nations scientists and nuclear physicists, and lahat pumunta ng Iraq, wala silang nakita. Ano nga sabi ng kanilang Secretary of State? Ang Amerika din ang nagdala niyan dyan, pero binaon na namin. We covered it with lead, kaya wala na talaga silang makikita. Can you imagine how it goes? That is how America works behind the scenes in countries where America has interest. Look back. So, ito na ngayon ang anak. Dito ngayon, bago pa itong si Ferdinand Marcos Jr., nakuha na ng Amerika yung mga ibang gusto nila. Nagkaroon na sila ng mga ibang arrangements. Pumasok na tayo sa WTO, lahat-lahat na yan. At dito, nung panahon pa rin ni Noynoy, nagkaroon na ng nung panahon pa ni General Ramos, Visiting Forces Agreement, unti-unti na pumapasok. Kasi wala na yung bases nila 1992, natapos na. And then of course, pumasok din sila dyan sa panahon ni President Noynoy Aquino, yung EDCA. Sa ngayon, ilan na itong EDCA? Dito naman sa kay President Ferdinand Marcos Jr. Sabi nila, 10 na daw, sabi ng iba 19. We really don't have an actual count, but sometime back I was mentioning all the other camps that they had already occupied. Kung babasahin niyo yung EDCA, number 1 provision is para makatulong daw sa climate change, para makatulong daw sa relief and restoration and rehabilitation, at incidentally ay magkakaroon din ng mga sundalo doon at saka mga military personnel, pero not specified kung anong ginagawa nila at bakit sila andon. Hindi namang sinasabi na lalaban sila sa China. Yun nga ang gagawin nila, tutulong sa atin sa mga rehabilitation, sa climate change, etc., etc., etc. Ilang bagyo nang dumaan, ilang baha na at lahat. Anyway, so if we really go down, kung hihimayin talaga natin, yun talaga ang makikita natin, the pattern as it is of how there have been movements behind the scenes or actually on stage. Sabi nga, we strut and fret upon this stage, signifying nothing, di ba? Anyway, so that is how it goes. Kaya mahalaga na pag-aralan natin, may bagong presidente ang Amerika. Ang ating presidente is only 2 years old, entering into his midterm. He has been able to consider the tightrope of where he is right now between America and China and the Philippines in the center. Remember, we are the gateway of the Americas to Asia. And Asia also, we are the gateway to enter America. Dadaan kasi sa atin lahat, parang tayong revolving door. So, our president is doing his best to be able to walk the tightrope sapagkat ang hawak niya, remember, the tightrope walker, may hawak niya na mahabang rod. Binabalanse niya ang sarili niya. Parang si Ferdinand Marcos Jr., siya yung naglalakad dyan sa tightrope. Hawak niya sa magkabilang kamay ang United States of America at ang China. So, Mr. President, look back every once in a while, see how the United States of America has played its way in and out of many of our foreign policies, etc., and their influence in trade and economy and etc., and then move on. So let us all be supportive. Remember, I've said this so many times, I will repeat it again, there is only one seat of power occupied by just one man. He sees everything, he knows everything, he's a brilliant man. And so it is in his hands that we lay our future now that another president of the United States of America is there at the White House. Marami pa akong makikwento, ngunit yan na muna ang ating simulan sa araw na ito. Look back, move on. Thank you for all of those who may be listening, who will be listening in the future, for all of those also who have watched us. Thank you for joining us. This has been your Chronicles, and this is Rita Gadi.